Welcome back to the RBD Block Challenge, and this week we are finishing our quilt. These are the finishing instructions for our 16 blocks that we previously made. So like always, you need to download the instructions on our Riley Blake Designs website. It says RBD Block Challenge Finishing, and there's instructions for if you're working with batiks or confetti cottons. You will notice to the side is the finished quilt for our batiks, and you'll notice the posts, and in the sashing is that square in the square unit. There is a non-directional piece. It makes it really easy to come together with that piece. Now look behind me also to the other side, and we have our finished RBD confetti cottons quilt. Now this sashing unit and our post unit uses a directional stripe. It's an 1/8 inch stripe, and you can see how important it is to get all your pieces going the same direction. And the instructions give it to go horizontal. Behind me, we also did a version that is vertical. So whichever way you choose to do your stripe, horizontal or vertical, just make sure you're consistent and all your units are facing the same direction. So let's get started on how to finish our quilt. You guys have worked so hard on making all your quilt blocks. Let's pull it all together. And we're gonna do it by making 65 of these square in the square units. You've done it before. It's easy to do, but you're gonna need to make 65, so it's gonna take you a minute to make all these units. So like always, if you don't have a Seam So Easy guide, mark corner to corner, and that is going to be your sew line. And instead of pinning, I like to just do a temporary heat adhesive and then take it to my machine and sew when they're on opposite corners. So right to the edge on the outside of that line. So when you flip it open, it lines perfectly up into a square. And we're going to flip it to the other side. Right. Let's take it here, get our 1/4 inch plus ruler, and we're going to trim down both sides. Again, you're going to be such a pro after you're done making all these little units. Okay, the flip and turn method, we're going to flip those open, press them open. I just like to let them cool a little bit under there. Okay. Then right sides together, put those other 2 squares on. Okay, I'm going to use my Seam So Easy guide and sew corner to corner on each of those little squares. Okay, so let's trim down to a 1/4 inch from the seam. Then we're going to just flip it open. You can set your seams if you want before you flip. Get everything nice and warm so it makes a nice flip. And let it kind of cool underneath this clapper. Okay, and this is what that unit looks like. It looks like I can trim this down a little bit. So I'm going to get my rotating mat, my square up ruler, and let's lay it on. What we want to see is that point on the inside of the blue line. And it looks like we can trim a little bit. And it looks like not much, but you know, make sure They are 2.5 inches, and it's going to make a difference in the, you know, if you're off 65, it's going to make a difference, right? So I trim that up, and that is ready to go. So you're going to need 20 sashing units with vertical squares, the square and the square. So you're going to hold it like this, and this is again running up and down, and you're going to put, to make these vertical sashing units, you're going to sew 2 sashing rectangles on each side of this. So I'm gonna make this unit, I'm gonna meet you back here and show you what it looks like. Okay, so we're gonna open that up like this, and if you look at the pattern, it tells you to press your seams out. So I'm gonna press my seams on the back side, and then this side. Just let that cool off underneath the clapper. And you're gonna make 20 of these units. So it's sewn like this, but this is what it's gonna look like in the quilt if you want the stripes to run horizontally in the quilt. So now I'm gonna grab, we're just gonna pretend we've made all of our units and all of our sashing, and now I'm gonna grab my quilt top that's already been sewn. I'm going to just talk about it a little bit. So I'm going to just put on the last row of this quilt top, and you'll see I've got these vertical sashing, and we've already made these. That's how they're going to go on. So they go between the blocks, and then we've got this long sashing which has the post sewn in. So it's interesting, you got this vertical sashing with this little unit in here, and then you've got these little posts on all 4 corners, but you sew the posts in on each of these long rows. And this is what they look like. So then you sew them a different direction of the sashing pieces, but when you put them in a quilt, they're all the same direction. So when you're making these units or that long piece, you're going to grab your little square in the square, and then you're going to sew these little rectangle units. You're going to sew that on, and then you're going to grab your next unit and sew it on until you've made a complete row, which is kind of your sashing and border in between. So let's get started on wrapping up this last row. So I've got these on individual, let me move these out of the way. I've got all these quilt blocks on individual design boards that helps you keep everything straight. So I love these design boards for that reason. And we're gonna start sewing because they're gonna lay out like this and see how that all works together. And so on the left hand side of the quilt block, we are going to sew these units on. So you can flip it over that direction if you prefer, or you can flip it over this way and then just turn it around when you're sewing it on. I think I'll do that. So I'm going to flip these over because we're going to chain piece these all together. And this unit at the end does have 2 sides you're working on. So let's just flip it this way. And you can choose to pin in place or not, but I always like to pin the center. So I'm going to line up that center point of that square in the square with the center part of this unit, like that. I'm going to line that up. And then I'm going to choose not to pin my 2 outsides. I'm going to flip that over. So I'm sewing on this side. There's no center to line up there, but because there is this square right here, so that's kind of the center. You can kind of eyeball that or line it up opposite. So you just want to square that up and pin it. If you're new to quilting and you feel like your fabric's going to shift, you can go ahead and throw a couple pins in. And if your border is bigger than, or your sashing piece is bigger than your quilt block, you're definitely going to want to pin it on both sides, because usually if you're off just a hair here and there, you're just going to give a tug to each side of the sashing so it squares it up like that. So that's good to go there. I'm going to flip that over here. Okay, I think we're ready to take it to our machine and sew. All right, I'm going to clip my threads in between and kind of keep them in order, but just pay attention to what order they are in. Now this block is the one that has 2 on each side, so I need to sew the other side on. Again, I'm kind of lining up to that middle. Okay, let me go sew this last sashing on. All right, let's take a look at this. We're going to lay this all out. So we're going to sew. I'm going to sew this unit to this, and this unit to this. Got a good pin. Just putting these long sashing pieces in. It is kind of interesting to have that in the middle of the sashing, that square and a square. Just adds some interest to the quilt, right? And then we're going to just make sure that lines up perfectly with that center right there. Okay. Let's line this up. And again, we're going to line that stripe up with the center there. Take this to the machine and sew. Okay, let's put the threads in between. We're almost done. Let's make sure we're got them lined up how we want. This flower goes over here. We have one last seam to our final row. Again, just center that. There we go. This is what it's looking like. Let me move my design boards out of the way. And we're going to grab our bottom of our quilt. Here we go. And we've already sewn this long line of, the strips that have our borders and posts on there. So we're going to flip this over, right sides together. And we're going to line that all up. So most of these units are going, are pressed outwards. And actually I haven't pressed much at all. So this is the time you can flip your seams the direction you want them to go. so you can nest those seams. Again, when you get to this little square in the square unit, you're going to still center it where it needs to be centered on the other block and pin it at that intersection. Now you're coming to the outside, and again, these are naturally all flopping out. So I am going to, this is going to go in. I'm going to nest the seams there. Nest the seams. So that's that. The sashing I'm going to press towards the middle, and then on this long strip it's going to be pressed out. So again, you're going to center that, make sure that is centered on those two units. So that's good to go there. Just takes time to put a quilt all together, right? And I'm not doing it this time, but I could have sewn this, our last sashing, or on the bottom of this right here. You could sew that on prior to putting on that last row, so you'd be done. But since I've already got this pinned, I'm just going to pin it to that bottom row after I sew this. Okay, let's bring this back. Let's take a look. Got it flipped the other direction. So that is looking good. The last thing I need to do, well, a couple more things. I'm going to sew this on just like we did before, this last row of sashing and posts and that middle section there. And I'll meet you back here when I've got that sewn on. Okay, we've sewn that last strip of fabric on, and this would be a good time if you want to get everything pressed. You can get everything pressed before you add your final border around the entire quilt. Now, the pattern gives you measurements for your final border. So you're going to sew the sides on, and then your top and bottom. And if you've sewn accurately and squared up things accurately along the way, you can use the measurements on the pattern. But if you're not confident everything's the right size, you can always lay out your quilt and measure it. Sometimes I even just, you can fold it in half and measure it on your board, and then write down your measurements on your sides, sew on your sides, and then your top and bottom. It's also an excellent time. You can see the size of the quilt here. It's a generous lap size quilt, but if you want to grow your quilt even more, you can add this border on, and then you can add an entirely new border, whatever size you want to grow your quilt. So this is a good time to do that. So I'm going to grab my side pieces, and a reminder of how to put your final borders on. I always give a press to the center of your border fabric, and then you find the center of your quilt, which is conveniently marked with a point on one of those posts. And you're going to line that up right sides together on that center. And it's really important to pin this, because if you need to stretch and pull your fabric to meet up, there is a little wiggle room to work with. So I kind of I put it in the center and then my two outsides. Oh, let's move that over there. There's our other border. Like this, and then I kind of just pull it, give it a little tug, and then your center here. So you can kind of eyeball it, pull it, find the center there, and pin it. And then I do in between these two pins as well. So pin here. So center, outside, find the center of both sides, pull it there, pin it, and do the same on the other side. I'm going to repeat this on the other side. Sew my two sides. I'm going to give it a press and then sew my top and bottom, and I'll meet you back here. I've finished my last border and the quilt is done. Isn't that so bright and beautiful? I'm calling this my happy quilt, and when I'm having a bad day, I'm going to get out this quilt and wrap myself up in it. I hope you've learned a thing or two as you're sewing along with us. If you've finished the quilt with me, congratulations. If you're still working on it, we'd love to see your finished quilt, so make sure you use the hashtag RBD Block Challenge. You can either do just a generic RBD Block Challenge or RBD Block Challenge 2024. We do a block challenge every year starting in January, so we hope you'll come back in January of 2025 and start the next challenge. But we have a lot of fun and educational videos in the meantime. So come back to our channel often. And again, we always welcome your comments and feedback on what you'd like to see in the future. So thank you for following along and sewing along with us on this RBD Block Challenge. We'll see you next time on our next challenge.